me today, and thank you to the organization at the Billy Bishop for having me come to speak. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge the event taking place on the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations ancestral territory. I think it's appropriate to consider that history as we look at artwork created by a country that has been invaded numerous times. Also a mild disclaimer. We have some mature subject matter, artwork that features some nudity, and allusions to violence. So, if anybody here is immediately affected by the traumas of war, keep that in mind. So I started this process of researching Ukrainian art in response to a series that I was producing that was based on photographs from my great-grandfather's time in World War II. And his family moved from Odessa 100 years ago, and they were fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution. So in this series, I was researching a lot of social realist artwork, and I was interested in history painting, narrative painting, and to produce that kind of artwork in a contemporary setting, to me it was sort of an avant-garde gesture already because of just the sort of repetition of historical events and violence, and through that I wanted to challenge this idea of progress in art as told by avant-garde art. And I think that we've been talking about this beforehand, but this is a painting of my great-grandfather, Bill Plishka, when he came back from the conflict. And I believe he would have met here at this Legion. So it's very appropriate and to be doing this presentation today, and I'm very honored. You guys didn't miss it. I just got started. So I was working with this idea of intergenerational trauma and the mental health of soldiers. And these are all oil on canvas. And this one is a painting of the fellows. They would have been observed for the effects of what they call flight effects, what we now call PTSD. And this would have been them years later. And I believe they're meeting in some kind of a Legion type situation. And a little chatter back there. So yeah, these works I put together in a show called A Rainy Day, and that we showed that in November. And so in that process, I ended up doing a lot of research about Russian and Ukrainian art history. And so I'd like to start that research at the 19th century. And I'd like to look at three artists. These were what were considered academic artists in Russia. And they're iconic or historically important artists in Russian art history, but they are Ukrainian. And the Met Museum actually classifies them now as Ukrainian artists, which is a controversial thing. This is the work of Ivan Aivazovsky. It's called The Wave, and it was painted in 1889. And again, sorry, another disclaimer that I forgot. I will mispronounce names today. There's no mistake of that. And so a lot of involved with this sort of dispute of the nationality or the originality of these paintings is currently going on in the war. Like, a lot of museums are being looted, artworks are being destroyed, but artwork is very much one of the casualties among the living. This is the work of Arkip Kunze. It's called Red Sunset, painted in 1908. And you'll note the sort of photorealistic painterly tendency. But the one that I really want to focus on for a few slides, his name is Ilya Repin. And he was born in Chudiv, 1844, and he passed away in 1930 in Finland, while in sort of exile. But this is his first significant painting called Barge Haulers on the Volga. It was painted in 1873, and it showed at the Vienna International Exposition. And this propelled Repin into a large, successful point in his career. His work started touring. He started getting shows in teacher positions in Russia. And he ended up exploring France and working around the Impressionists. This is a Paris cafe, 1875. And so you'll notice that there's like a proximity to French culture in Russia, especially in the 19th century. Historians have a joke that they say that Russia culturally takes on the identity of its enemy. And so you'll see that idea coming up with relation to the French, and particularly like modernist forms of painting. But Rapin was also quite controversial. This is Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, also named Ivan, from 1885. And so this depiction of a historical scene, part of Russia's identity and culture, is something that will repeat itself. But note the attention to detail on the embroidery. And one thing I really like about Rapin is his attention to the eyes. His characters often have this very jarring stare. Like you can really see the whites of their eyes. This painting was very controversial and it was not allowed to be shown. It was taken down and put into storage. And actually, I think it was Tsar Nicholas II that brought it out of its storage and allowed it to be shown again. Rapin was also a very close friend of Tolstoy. This is Tolstoy writing at Yasanya Polyana Pushkin House, 1891. And so Rapin is like documenting Russian culture, and he's become like a very integral part of the Russian identity. He's commissioned by the government a number of times to paint these scenes of celebration of Russian society. This is a painting titled Celebration of the Russian Constitution from 1905. And later in his life, you'll see that he starts to analyze his Ukrainian heritage, and he depicts a number of times moments of Ukrainian history, such as the Cossacks and various different agreements, Cossacks agreements with the Turkish. But you see him sort of start to question and analyze his relationship to Ukraine. And this is Ukrainian Woman from 1876. And this is, on the right, the last Rapin painting, and it was painted between 1926 and 1930. So he wins various awards, and there's awards named after him, and he's a figure that we'll see allusions to and references to like later in Russian history. Now, in the late 19th century, modernism begins to spread in Russia, and you see ideas such as Impressionism, Futurism, Cubism, all of these avant-garde or new forms of painting start to make their way towards Russia. And that is because of the presence of a bourgeois society in Russia at that time. And so the presence of these art forms become a very controversial and contentious item. And this is a painting, Self-Portrait with Sister, 1898 by Victor Borisov. And he is considered the inventor of Russian symbolism. And so these paintings, Phantoms, 1903, and Autumn Song, are examples of symbolism. They move away from this strict depiction of history and a more flowing and expressive form of production. And then they also have the Russian Art Nouveau. This is Mikhail Vrubel, The Princess and the Dream, 1896. Very interesting period of time. The artwork's also reflected in architecture and furniture and embroidery, theater design. And I want to make mention of what one group called the Blue Rose Group, formed by Pavel Netsov. And so this one on the left is Eastern Motive from 1914, and on the right is Self-Portrait from 1906. And Pavel was really concerned with depictions of life in Kyrgyzstan. Now, while it's now its own state, that's another sort of parallel experience to that of Ukraine. So what I think is interesting at that time is you see these sort of figurations, almost cartoon-like. They're very reminiscent of like the German Expressionist period, and the use of color is very playful. And this kind of fanciful art is called like laissez-faire, or it has no social concern. You'll see them being targeted by various like revolutionary intellectuals. So this presence of avant-garde art and intellectual Western European art is seen as a big problem for the politicians and radical politicians in Russia at the time. And so, to give a brief history, condensation of a very complex period of time, in 1903, the Bolshevik Party forms. In 1905 to 1906, there's the Democratic Revolution and Reform. So that leads to 1917, when the February Revolution and the October Revolution occur. The October Revolution is considered the Bolshevik Revolution. And so from 1917 to 1922 is the Civil War. Eventually in 1924, Stalin succeeds Russia. And so to put things into perspective from a painterly way, in 1907, Cubism is conceived in France by Picasso. And the creation of that art form has a lot of significance in the Russian art communities. And Cubism is often seen in those circles as a bourgeois art, like that it's just entertainment and that it serves no purpose for society. But formally, it stirs a lot of connections. And this is on a side, Lenin with Villagers by Evdokia Vysokia from 1959, and that's a Ukrainian painter. So Casimir Malevich, who is actually Ukrainian-born, begins to paint. He moves away from Cubism and Futurism and develops this idea that he calls suprematism. And suprematism is all about it's intense. It's the totality of art. It does away with the idea of representation. And he writes all these manifestos very similar to the Communist Manifesto. And so here's a portrait of him from 1900. And then he stages a work. He stages a show called the 0.10 exhibition in Petrograd in 1915, just after Russia is cut off from the West. So the work that you'll see next is very iconic, and we might find it hard to understand now, but at that time it's extremely radical. This is the black square, and it's supposed to represent this sort of almost cosmic relationship to art in the society. And what he arrived at this with many different iterations. The painting itself is layered with paint. And the next one is called White on White from 1918. So it's interesting in the context of history, personally. But what we see with the continuation of suprematism is historians consider these now influenced by Ukrainian culture, and textiles and colors and fabrics and that sort of thing seem to appear in Malevich's work. So his work is extremely important to the work of abstraction in the West, and it ultimately leads to a competitive form of art known as constructivism. Whereas suprematism is a deconstruction, it's anti-materialist and anti-utilitarian. Constructivism is utilitarianism. It believes in art as a functional device of society. So it's often used for propaganda. And it was formed by Vladimir Tatlin and Alexander Rodchenko. And you'll see these items being used, or this style being used a lot in architecture, in print, in theater. And this mode of art is really used by Lenin and the Bolsheviks to sort of propel the idea of communism and to support the benefits of their society, to introduce the future and a sleek new vision. And ultimately, it becomes used for propaganda. And the one on the left, that's what's called an agitprop poster by Mayakovsky. And then on the right is called Pron Vrashkenya by L. Lisitsky from 1919. And then we have El Lissitzky's Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, 1919. I mean, the symbolism is pretty easy to pick up. And on the right, we have an ad for the Niji Publishing House, and it's from a portrait of Lily Brick by Alexander Rodchenkov, 1924. So, you know, like the brutalist architecture that you see in Russia is often influenced by like these geometric, hard edge shapes. And unfortunately, after the takeover of Stalin, you see a dramatic shift in the amount of art that is allowed to exist in Russia. So beforehand, you have like these various avant-garde schools, and Ukraine is actually home to a number of art programs in Odessa, and these different theologists or these different ideologies that are allowed to compete with each other. But then after Stalin, it's reduced. Everything else is outlawed, and artists actually find themselves being targeted. They're put in gulags and work camps, and a lot of them perish. And so there's only like a few artists that were allowed to survive, and this union of artists still exists today. It's one of the longest running art associations in the world. So under Stalin, they adopt socialist realism, and it becomes the official art style of the Soviet Union from 1932 until 1988. And it's characterized by the depiction of communist values and the emancipation of the proletariat. And they close all these avant-garde schools. And this piece is by Isaac Brodsky, who is another Ukrainian artist working in socialist realism. And he was actually a pupil of Repin, who we met earlier. This is Lenin and Smolny, 1930. It's a painting that's supposed to depict Lenin just before he presents a grand speech about the success of communism. This is a work by Tatiana Yablonska. It's called Bread, from 1949. You'll see the idea of bread as well as the role of women in the Soviet Union come up quite a bit. The February Revolution was actually sparked by a female-led protest over the rationing of bread. So the other interesting thing about socialist realism is that it's not actually realistic, right? Of course, these scenes never... Well, yeah, they never actually exist. And so what happens as well is like for the early portion of socialist realism, it's quite strict. But because it's the official artwork of the country, when they're over time, what they call a thawing happens after Stalin, where socialist realist painters are now allowed to be a bit more expressive, be a bit more liberal with their use of color, and a lot of comparisons are made to the German Expressionist movement at the interwar periods. And so you see a lot of things that might be considered like, degenerate uncouth that occur like later in socialist realism. This is The Tea Party by Viktor Ivanov. And so the big thing about like socialist realism is this lasting impression of Ilya Repin and this desire for the state to go back to this like majestic and true calling of Russian art. Now, I want to mention as well that there is a lesser known amount of Ukrainian socialist realism that's starting to be discussed. This is a Ukrainian artist. It's harder to find this kind of information now. There are some collections that specifically collect Ukrainian socialist realists, but because of the contentious nature and difficulty in maintaining those records and archives at that period of time, it's harder to find that work. And so I want to talk about the Ukrainian underground, because while all of the state-led artwork is occurring, there's a resistance on the part of Ukrainian artists to continue producing artwork in hiding. So they produce art shows that take place in apartments or in secret locations, but they continue to produce artwork. And I think that's really important to understand. And it's also very difficult to study because of the secret nature of those works. This is by Nicholas Zalewski. It's called Once Upon the Night from 1974. And there's a lot of similarities to surrealism, like Leonora Carrington. And it's a tragedy that these artists had to produce this artwork with little to no resources in fear of their own safety. On the left is a portrait of writer G. Tutienik by Y. Luch from 1979. And on the right is Balcony Painting by Anatoly Samar from 1958. And so they are able to experiment in the underground with these various modes of art that were outlawed but were popular in Western Europe for the time. We got here Man in Infinity by F. Tetianik from 1980. That's a bronze casting. And then Self-Portrait with Victor Pivorevoy, Edward Gurakovsky by Irina Yeshevlavska from 1975. Starflowers by V. Baklitsky from 1990. And then on the right is M. Treehub, Zonally Color Concept, 1980. And I find it interesting as well to note that this artwork would have been considered outlaw. I think by our tendencies here, we might consider this artwork quite nice. But that is the unfortunate reality for those artists at the time. As well, there's a prevalence of Ukrainian folk art. Mostly it gets used for things like children's illustrations. And this is the work of Maria Primachenko, and it's called A Dove Has Spread Her Wings and Asks for Peace from 1982. And a lot of her work has been destroyed in the last year.
Oh, no.
And this is called Our Army, Our Protectors from 1978. And so this sort of maintaining of the Ukrainian traditions and patternry, I think, is very touching, and a lot of that is done with a lot of bravery. So this Ukrainian underground leads the way to the Ukrainian New Wave, which is concerned with the postmodern forms of painting. And as the Soviet Union begins to fade, some of these artists, they're painting in the 1980s, and their explosion really happens in the 90s after the Perestroika agreement and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So their artwork operates with the multiplicity of ideology. They have all these different terminologies that they develop that allow themselves to express this complexity or freedom. For instance, polystylism. So there's this really no holds barred kind of approach to their artwork. This is the work of Alexander Rochberg. He was born in Odessa, 1961, and he passed away in 2021 in Kiev. He passed away of cancer, but he was a huge figure. He was director of museums, educator, and a wildly prolific painter, and very imaginative. On the left, we have Generosity of Alexander the Great, and on the right is Mary and the Three Theological Virtues. So this sort of blending of religious themes and kind of horrific imagery is something that can only really exist at this time. Other artists include Arsen Savadov, Untitled, 1996. And then on the right is Elena Golub from Series 2, 2019. It's a mixed digital media print. I find the one on the left here is very interesting, considering the sort of experience of military in that country, like the dissection or parody of masculine military ideals. The bunny ears is pretty funny. Ukrainian media art is something that I'll touch on really briefly. In the 90s, it becomes very big as artists are embracing postmodern art production techniques and trying to basically catch up to the West. And Ukrainian video artists toured widely at that time. Some of that work is harder to find, but if you're interested in continuing your research, I encourage you to take a look. So I'm going to move towards the more contemporary Ukrainian artists, and I'd like to speak about Nikita Kazan, who is born in 1982. He's sort of considered part of the new generation of Ukrainian artists. His work falls into the conceptual world, and he's actually he's living in Kyiv, and he's currently living in a bunker. There's an art gallery that used a converted Soviet-era bunker, so he's able to stay there because it's safe. But also in Ukraine, a lot of museums are they're full of people essentially trying to protect the artwork. They don't know what to do, so they stay with the artwork. They live with it. They live with the collection, and they'd rather perish along with it. So he's currently living next to archives of Ukrainian art, and this one is called The Project of Ruins, and I think it's interesting. It's an interesting use of Russian history in the brutalist constructivist architecture that we touched on earlier, and there's this participatory element to the sculpture. This is a project called The Shelter from 2015. It was produced in response to the 2014 invasion, and there's a lot of symbolism in there about naturalism and tires that are used to barricade streets, and the role of a museum, a natural history museum, in sort of protecting a viewer from an imaginary space. And then below it, this sort of bunker / urban garden. I think that that kind of artwork is produced by somebody who is very much living through the circumstances of war. This is called Small House of Giants from 2012, and he's again talking about the duality between the Soviet history and the capitalized future. On one hand, you have a sterile facade or abstraction, and on the other side is sort of the gritty reality. This is a series called The Procedure Room, and it ran from 2009 until 2010. A series of plates decorated with images of the torture devices of the Soviet Union, such as using a book to block the immediate blow so that bruising doesn't occur as easily. This is called Hold the Thought, where the story was interrupted. Untitled Natural History Department. Again, there's that idea of the separation and what is displayed as an illusion or a falsehood, and the natural species within this semi-apocalyptic war zone. I find those very evocative. Unfortunately, you can't see quite as well the detail here in this series. These are called The Surfaces, but they're a reference to Malevich, and I think that's again about sort of identifying with another Ukrainian artist. And they're paintings of in the drawings, the graphite lines are all public spaces, and he's replaced all the advertising spaces with these colored squares that recall supremacism. And this is from the Chronicle series, and again, it's an installation, it's a 2D artwork. And you'll see a lot of Ukrainian artists this kind of use of what looks like derelict materials, what might have been a bed or a piece of architecture that's been bent and destroyed, that relates to wartime and the delicacy of the public space. And another artist, young Ukrainian artist, conceptual artist, is Zena Kadyrova. She was born in 1981. And on the left is a project from just last year called Palianitsia. These are found river stones that are cut to look like loaves of bread. Again, this idea of bread. And on the right, Oh, you know, that's from the same series. Yeah, these embroidered pictures that recall Ukrainian textile works, and the kind of humor that's involved with the stony sandwich, relating to, again, that idea of rationing and lack or provision. And she shows with a gallery called Gallery Continua that's located in France, and they're quite notable. I had a great time researching her work, actually. This is a project done in a Kiev coffee factory with repurposed tiles from 2015. She uses repurposed tiles from Soviet-era architecture, and I think that like this series is very cheeky, very smart, and it's toured extensively. This is the work of Olga Valema, born in 1984 in Lviv. She is now New York based. She's a conceptual artist, and I like what she does with conceptual art. It has a little bit more teeth than what one might commonly think of in conceptual art, where it has a very codified set of rules that makes it hard to approach for most people. I think that there's some humor here, and she's using materials and architecture in a way that kind of questions our identity and memory. And the materials in this one, this is called Become a Stranger to Yourself from 2017. And it's made with fabric, latex, photos, silicone, soft PVC, steel, and water. So she's created like a bag and placed all these items inside. And this is called On the Brink of My Sexy Apocalypse. And it's from 2017. I think this one has an interesting sort of allusion to green screen spaces, and again, this idea of like media and documentation and illusion, which I think is very prevalent in Ukrainian and Soviet art. And this one's called Ungestalt from 2017. Oh no, yeah, Ungestalt, yeah. And again, this use of like discarded fabrics and that sort of look like the remnants of some sort of conflict or combat. I think that Ukrainian artists are uniquely positioned when it comes to contemporary art spaces, and the ones that leave seem to do very well, and their work has a clear sense of like something to say, and that they've experienced things that are begging to be depicted in any form. Now I'd like to talk about some more contemporary illustrators that I've been following over the last year of the occupation and the invasion. Colin, you were asking about comic artists, so this is your section. So this is, I'm going to start with Anna Ivanenko. And so the thing is that some of these illustrators are still living in Ukraine, and so they're depicting the day-to-day life. I'll hold for you to get. Have you got the? Did you get the QR code?
I haven't got it activated yet.
I'll make sure that if it's not working for you from there, that we get it at the end. I just thought that it might be nice to include the QR code because I think that witnessing the work of these artists is really important. There. So her work is. She's made a lot of comic expressions around the invasion that sort of document her experience, trying to survive, obtain rations, go to work, people raising kids. These kind of first-hand experiences of the invasion that are extremely gripping. And while it's interesting to note that because of the technology that's available now, a lot of these artists are able to produce and exhibit their work immediately with an iPad and I find that a unique situation that we haven't really quite seen before, and it also serves to sort of they understand the rules of propaganda and who tells what story. because of the lessons that they've learned from their. This is Oksana Drachkovska, and I believe she's fled to Barcelona. And while her work has a more of a there's a hopeful element to the way that she's illustrating, and also she's got that element of Ukrainian folk art and imagery and design elements. But you see these cute cartoons that depict the day-to-day of an invaded country. And she does a lot of children's storybook illustration. And I personally notice similarities in her work between the Blue Rose group and some of the late 19th century, early 20th century modernist artwork that was eventually banned from Russia.
Sorry.
Well, yeah.
What is she pouring on the right there?
It looks like she's rationing salt.
Salt.
Yeah. So yeah, and also the experience of children who have to, be educated in metro stations and while on the move. This one here is really sad and telling. Son, you were in such a good mood. Of course, Dad, for 2 days there were no sirens. And of course, depictions of the violence against women during the invasion, which is extremely troubling. But these artists really have a voice in this medium, and it's extremely powerful. It's at such a moment where social media exists that we can view these artists' work and also show support to them. Mary Kinovich. It looks like a depiction of a traditional Cossack kind of hat and facial hair. And again, there's almost these elements of jagged and opposing geometric shapes that recall the history of abstraction in Russia. I really think it's special how loose these illustrations are, and yet how powerful they are. They really they don't need much time to be worked to really make an impact. There's some looting going on from a Russian soldier. That I don't know quite the name for that imperialist Russia symbol, the double-headed eagle, but clutching a bar of oil. Or a pipe, oil pipe. And 2 weeks of war, and I'm trying to figure out my life. Trying to figure out my life in general here. I can't imagine what it's like for these artists. But yeah, I would encourage everybody to take a look at these artists if you're interested, and you can even just following and liking and sharing with other people is an important way of how these artists survive. And I glazed over a lot of different artists today. I was only able to give you a real snapshot of what is going on. If you're interested in Ukrainian artists, there's a wealth of them. Ukraine is home to a very strong creative identity, history, traditions, and I think that in the face of such adversity, I'm really inspired by the fact that they utilize art in such a way. It really brings into sharp focus the importance of visual culture during war. During times of peace, we can get kind of comfortable and forget about these things, but when it comes down to it and we're defending our way of life, and the artwork becomes, incredibly vital. And I think that's the main point that I wanted to illustrate today. And I would like to make an honorable mention of Jason Echko, who's a local artist with Ukrainian heritage. He's a figurative painter. And he recently had a series of work on display at the Pendulum Gallery on Georgia Street. And he is actively investigating his Ukrainian identity, his privilege as an artist in Canada, and painting what is the experience and maybe the spirit of war and conflict and why these things occur. So this is what is this series called again? I forget. Sorry. These are like sort of almost like religious diptychs. You know, the paintings that would fold out like Hieronymus Bosch's. So this one folds out into this, and so you kind of see this group of people sitting at the table, and then what looks like a bombed out factory, and again that sense of provisional existence during the wartime. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, guys. We do have time for questions, comments, anecdotes, or conversation. If anybody likes, please don't feel shy. James.
You personally connected with any of these artists?
Personally connected, I am not. I considered contacting some of them beforehand. I've spoken to Jay, but I have not spoken to some of the contemporary Ukrainian artists. I would like to. I was more in the process of trying to anticipate this presentation and get everything together. But I think it would be rewarding in a spiritual, personal sort of way to develop some kind of project or communication with them, or even to show some of their work in Vancouver, where we do have a strong Ukrainian community.
Sure.
Yeah.
You have a Ukrainian heritage, right?
Myself, I do. Yeah. Legally, my name is Dylan Plishka-Humphreys,
Right.
which is a bit of a mouthful for prints and promotion things. But yeah, so I haven't really been able to get a hold of the Ukrainian background a whole lot because of it was my great grandfather that moved over. So that I don't have any memories of Ukrainian being spoken in the family or materials and that sort of thing. I think due to their leaving the country in such a way that they're fleeing the Bolshevik persecution. But yeah, it's been. I think the invasion was something that evoked feelings for me, knowing that my family history is tied to that, and that those things are still going on today.
Do you have family members over there that you know?
We do.
Are they still there?
There was one fellow in particular that we were in contact with via Facebook, but we have not heard from him since the invasion. Yeah, but we were previous to that. Yeah.
Gus.
Could you perhaps give us a bit, just whatever you personally know or think about the sunflower symbolism that is so common, especially now?
The sunflower symbolism, I believe that's just a flower that grows freely, and it's sort of the colors, the yellow is a parallel to the flag. I don't know a whole lot about further than that, but I suggest it would probably have to do with the agrarian sort of identity of Ukraine.
Yeah. There's a I'm repeating hearsay essentially, but there's a curse that Ukrainians will offer sunflower seeds to Russian soldiers so that when they die, flowers will grow out of their bodies.
Oh, wow.
And we used to make tsenki, so those are the decorated eggs every year with my grandparents, and the sunflower was very simple. Was one a key, along with the wheat and deer. There was some very traditional symbolism. It's interesting to note that symbolism was so strong that it survived so many generations, and even was brought with Ukrainians to the New World, and then passed on to the next generation. That's some serious dedication, really, when you think about it, and obviously so important and had such high value I mean, they grew sunflowers, so.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, it most likely would have been like one of those things, like because Ukrainian immigrants were given parcels of land in Saskatchewan in the 30s.
Yes, so when they came here, they were given a parcel of land, and there's a cool picture of, like, so it would have been my great grandmother, and she's in traditional clothes of that era, which were, possibly constricting. They look constricting and very coupling. She wore, the blouse, the full blouse, high collar, tucked in, long sleeves, long dress, but she is coated head to toe in dirt. And behind her is a sod house that my grandmother told me they when they came here they had nothing. They babies still on their carting babies and small children, and they would arrive on their plot of land and literally dig out sod and build these sod houses. That their Finnish. I think she said their Finnish neighbors taught them how to build. Yeah, Finnish and Norwegian neighbors taught them how to build, and so I mean, and there she is. There's a picture of her with her hands on her hips, just filthy, and this sod house behind her, like just so proud, beaming, which was not typical of the era because people rarely smiled in photographs.
Right.
It was not. Yeah.
Thanks, Mom. What a great resource.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Of course you can.
You said I know a little bit about the Czech and Hungarian sort of offsprings of immigrants, but you're saying with the Ukraine, they were fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah.
I don't know a ton about that revolution. I'm reading about it now. It didn't seem like something where they would persecute working people. It seemed the opposite to the thesis of what that whole revolution was about.
Well, the thing is that there was a lot of racial and religious, and also our family. I think in terms of that era, they were landowners.
Yeah.
So that meant that they were less ideal for the party goals.
And
Was there any orthodoxy involved?
So our family background was Ukrainian Orthodox.
Yeah, they were not big on the Orthodox.
No,
Like
not
a
at all.
Sense on
Yeah.
that level. But
Yeah, and they were very like my grandfather was not. He was actually an atheist, but his family had been very religious, and the story that I heard was that actually it was their Orthodox church that did help many of them to leave and come to Canada.
And I believe there was also already a tradition of Ukrainian immigration to Canada, starting
Yes,
at least as
yes.
early as like the 1880s, I
Yeah,
think.
they were part of the second wave.
Yeah.
They're called the second wave.
yeah, Canada was encouraging it actively.
Yeah.
So I saw something over at in Victoria recently.
Right.
Where they show the posters of them saying,
Yeah.
"Do Ukrainians come to Canada?" For
Well, it's funny that they would promote that, but at the same time, in like World War I, they would have Ukrainians were placed into camps.
Yeah, I just went back to Vernon, my hometown, to look into immigration policy.
Right.
My father helped form the immigrant services there. So,
Right.
And yeah,
Weren't
Ukrainians were interned in Vernon.
Yeah.
Weren't there citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire?
Yes. And it's interesting because I remember my grandfather at times telling me that he was like, I think especially as like that next generation of immigrants, like for his family, they identified, of course, as I think Ukrainian, but he was clear that they considered themselves Austro-Hungarians, and because of how borders, and he explained it to me, I was like, a child and very confused. I'm like, so which is it? Pick one. And he explains that obviously borders had a tendency to move around, and it was there was a lot going on in that part of the world for many years, and so those borders changed, and those classifications obviously would have changed.
I went to a stamp collectors convention, and there was a display from a town I think is now in the Ukraine that between World War I and the end of World War II was under 8 different governments.
Oh my lord.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some interesting attitudes, like that's another thing, the perspective, of people that live in that part of the world. Like we were talking beforehand about within Russia, citizens that have to show their protest or disagreement with the invasion in these sort of quiet ways to avoid, punishment. And it's tragic, but in those moments, I think there's a lot of humor. And myself, I've worked with different people, like say for instance the film industry, who grew up within the Soviet Union, in Czechoslovakia, and they have some incredible stories, and it's such a different experience to that which I have, which is very sheltered upbringing in Canada. So it's I think it's important to consider the pandemic and the lockdown. I think represented something happening to, for instance, like my generation as a millennial that we haven't ever experienced. We would have only understood events like that as a chapter in our history textbook. So I think to understand the tangibility or the imminence of those kind of circumstances is crucial, and that's what art really is for. Does anybody else have a commentary or anything of that nature? We'll go Gus and Colin.
Oh, I just wanted to say one thing about this piece of art specifically. You said this is quite contemporary, correct?
Yeah, this was made in the last few years.
Yeah, in addition to it being a reference to a Roman Catholic triptych, I think it also is reminiscent of the Mad magazine hidden picture.
Yeah. I like that. Al Jaffe is 100 years long.
Sorry?
Al Jaffe, the artist who started the Mad Foldings.
Oh, cool.
Colin, do you know how old he
He
is?
turned 102.
102
weeks ago.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. Yes.
And that's considered so contemporary. Isn't that wild?
I didn't realize that was such a well-known artistic convention.
Yeah, Mad Max. It's again that the idea of low or high art. In art school, the discussion of comic books.
So this artist was directly referencing Roman triptychs when he was making the Mad magazine hidden picture illustrations.
Oh, maybe Al Jaffe. Yeah, he could. Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. A lot of those guys they would have been educated cartoonists. Cartooning was a fresh, hugely viable, successful kind of industry, especially New York in the 30s.
And that's his background, I believe. His family fled the Cossacks. So I think
Oh, right. Oh, interesting. Huh. Colin, do you have?
Well, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on. It seems like the last section with the illustrators.
Yeah.
That seems to have replaced the classical political cartoon.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
I don't know if you ever came across any of that in your studies.
Political cartoons. That's a good point. I feel like because of the I guess that would be something that would have happened in the 90s, right? In Ukrainian newspapers and everything. Whereas, I'm sure that Soviet era political illustrations might not have even existed, but that would be something I'd be interested in researching more.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's something about these works that translate better online
Yeah.
than political cartooning.
Yeah. But they say that social media and Instagram has sort of replaced the magazine. I miss magazines. They tape better for artists, didn't they?
Because you want to cut them up and use them for collages.
Yeah, or just roll them up and hold on to them and hoard them, leave them at your parents' place.
And I did notice that some of them were using English.
Yep. Yeah. I think that allows them to, see how their work can be distributed more easily and find a wider audience. And yeah, there's like I said, we can if anybody's interested in talking to me afterwards and getting those names and what have you, for sure, please do. But thank you very much. I'm gonna stop the live stream. It's officially over. Thanks to people who might be watching on the internet. Hello, and hope you all have a lovely weekend. Thank you.